Hey everyone, welcome back to AWS On Air, where we are live here in Anaheim, California for the AWS Reinforce Convention for 2023. I'm one of your co-hosts, Jeff Marushak. I'm a senior solutions architect on our DoD Air Force team, and I'm joined with my co-host, Jasmine. Jasmine, say hello.
Hello, I'm back again. I know I just said, hey, I'm not going to be back, but here I am. I'm a manager of product management here at AWS in our partner marketing organization.
And we are also joined by Neha and Jillian. Could you guys introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Neha. I am a director in AWS Identity. I work on fun things, including verified permissions.
Hi, and I'm Julian Lovelock. I'm the product manager for the Amazon Verified Permissions product that we launched yesterday.
All right, so I guess let's just start there. This was launched yesterday. Give us a brief overview of what was announced and what verified access is.
Sure, so verified permissions.
Permissions.
No. So verified permissions is a product used by application developers to build permissions management and authorization into their applications.
So this is not into an AWS account. We're not talking IAM. We're talking application permissions.
Yeah, right, Jeff. So that's a super important distinction.
Yep. Okay, so how does that work? Is it just like, I'm not a developer, so explain how a developer would use this new feature.
So you're developing an application, right? Well, you're not, because you're not a developer, but fictionally. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you're building an application, I don't know, it manages healthcare data, or it manages financial accounts.
Okay.
You're going to have to build rules into that application that describe and control what users of the application are permitted to do. So some users are going to be able to access some accounts, some users are going to be able to create direct debits, some users are only going to be able to view. All of those rules we can describe as permissions. They are the permissions that describe what users are allowed to do. So what the product lets you do is configure those rules or express those rules as policies, permissions policies.
Okay.
They're codified rules that describe what users are allowed to do based on the role that the user's in, or the attributes of the user, or the attributes of the account they're trying to access. And so the developer can create these policies that describe what permissions a user has, and then the application that he or she's building will call our service, which will evaluate those policies each and every time a user tries to do something in the application.
And that's important, because I know where you're going to go with this. What does that help with, that each and every time?
Zero trust.
Oh, we're at a security conference. We haven't heard that term enough. But you're right. Zero trust is part of that principle is to not just enter your password and get past the first gate and then you're good to go. It is every single thing you do, checking what device you're using, who you are, should you be able to do this exact thing, et cetera, et cetera. And it sounds like this is going to help with that.
Yeah, 100%. So really two of the things about zero trust that we're helping with this product. You know, we're not a magic bullet. No one should be out there saying they're a magic bullet. But if you want to build an application that follows the principles of zero trust, you need to make sure that the permissions within those applications are narrowed down as tightly as possible. You shouldn't be creating general purpose roles that let somebody do everything. You're like, give the user exactly the permissions that he or she needs.
Yep.
And the other thing you need to do is every time that user does something in the application, go check those permissions again. The circumstances might have changed. The IP address might have changed. The rules around who's allowed to do what might have changed while they're logged onto the application. So that continual re-verification is what we enable, basically.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot of buzz about this launch. As we were launching the show this morning, people were in the comments saying, hey, I'm so excited to hear about verified permissions. So Neha, I'm going to switch to you. Tell us what was so innovative about this launch.
Absolutely. There's a lot of things, and as Julian talked about, it really empowers developers to decouple their authorization logic from their business logic. It provides them security because now you don't have a core aspect of who has access to what intermingled in your code. Who knows what your code does? And the other part that I'm super excited about, and we've been investing in this in AWS for the past 5 years, is something called automated reasoning. It's the use of mathematical logic to prove correctness of code and systems. To give you an overview, what is automated reasoning? generative AI is the buzz right now, where there's the use of large language models to generate content. What automated reasoning does instead, it has specialized fact models about a specific domain, and from that model, it can derive new facts. So we built a specialized fact model for the authorization that runs verified permissions. And from that, we were able to derive new facts such that your forbid statement always trumps your permit statement. It's secure by default. Order of your policies don't matter. And these are powerful capabilities, and the mathematical model is actually open source. People can go look it out, check it out. And then to say, how does the model and your implementation match, we use a technique called differential random testing, where it generates the tests on the model and then validates that the behaviors hold on the implementation as well.
Gotcha. So you mentioned that the developers would make the application call this service. Can you walk me through how that works? Is this an API call, or how is it set up?
Setting it up is actually super easy. You go create something called a policy store, where you're going to start creating policies. And then the first thing you do is, for the nouns and verbs of your application, what are your resources, what are your users, what are the actions, you create a few policies, and then you make an API call. Is Sally authorized to view photos? And then what verified permission does, it goes and sees, what does Sally have access to? Does it have access to the photos that she's requesting to? And if it does, it says yes. And it tells, in addition to the answer, to the yes or no answer, it also tells you, why does Sally have access to? And if it doesn't, why does Sally not have access to? And the end user doesn't have to write any policy, because they're just using a photo sharing app, and they can say, hey, what it is. And the application developer can control access in the back end.
Gotcha. So I could see maybe like a profile for like a basic tier user, maybe a different profile for like a paid user, another profile for like a dev user, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that sounds exciting. And what's interesting, you mentioned the concept of least privileged. As an SA, we talk to our customers about that for infrastructure, but it's also important for application security as well. So that's very interesting.
Absolutely. And it's application security and data security, because the application controls the access to the data.
Yes.
And that's where all of it ties back to zero trust, because you want to ensure access through the front door. You want to control least privilege access to your infrastructure. You want least privilege access to your application, and you want least privilege access to your data.
Yeah. So I can imagine, I've seen a lot of customers with their applications have different ways of creating users. Maybe it's an internal application using like a Active Directory, or maybe it is using AWS accounts, probably not. Maybe it's using Cognito or doing some sort of quick, does this new feature have the ability to support all of those user bases?
Yeah, it does. So it's important to distinguish between the authentication, which is checking that this user is who they say they are, and the authorization.
Okay.
So we're focused on the authorization. We're agnostic to where that user is stored and how that authentication was done, or rather what party did that authentication.
Okay.
So regardless of whether you're using an AWS product like Cognito, or you're using a third-party partner product like Ping, or you're building your own user database, it doesn't matter to verified permissions where that user profile is stored, where that authentication was done.
Great point. Yeah, awesome.
You could use any identity provider you want. And we provide a very easy workflow if you are an Amazon Cognito users, where you can use the attributes that are part of your Cognito in your policies easily. It's with a couple of clicks, you can import the attributes. And you can also use a Cognito token with the isAuthorized call that we were talking about. So it's like peanut butter and jelly.
Yeah,
great.
For sure.
Yep. So where do you want people to go if they want to learn more about verified permissions?
So go to the website, go to the product page, Amazon Verified Permissions on the product page. and tell you all about the product, pricing, FAQs. It'll also provide links to the CEDA policy site. The policy language that these permissions are expressed in is a language called CEDA, which we open sourced back on May the 10th. And so there's a whole repo with an SDK and the language specs and everything out there in the public domain as well, which is a big part of the overall story here.
Yeah, you can go to the AWS Management Console, search for verified permissions, and get started. It's very easy. In a few clicks, you can get started, create your first policy.
That's great. Would you be able to walk us through like a typical policy, like just kind of what all? There's probably the identity or who the account, the action, the allow or deny. Is there anything more in that? Or just walk us through.
Sure.
Someone's first verified permissions policy that they would make.
So let's say you want to create a policy that lets anyone in the user group, Kelly's friends, access all of Amir's photos from when he went on holiday to Brazil last year.
Okay.
So in this scenario, we've got a group. Oh, and by the way, some of those photos are going to be tagged as private, so you don't want to let them see that.
Okay.
Okay. So your policy is going to have three parts. Firstly, you're creating a permit policy. So that's the effect, permit. You could also create forbid policies. The second part of the policy is what we call the scope. That's the broad definition of who's allowed to do what to what. In this case, it's anyone in the group Kelly's friends can take the following actions: read, comment, repost on any photo in the group Amir's Brazil holiday. And then the last part of the policy is an extended set of conditions that you can qualify the scope with. So in our example, we said, well, we want to rule out policies that are marked as private. So then you'd have a condition at the bottom of the policy that said, when resource dot is private equals false. And that adds a qualification to the policy. And you can extend that list of qualifications.
Yeah.
So about the groups, I'm glad you brought up the groups. It's the application's responsibility to send the group information to the service, right? Because the service isn't going to check what groups a user is a member of. Am I right there?
Yes, so it's going to send the information in the request. So there's a request that comes in, and an application already processes it, and it'll say, "Hey, what are the groups that this user is part of?" It'll process that information, put it in the request context that is passed to the is authorized call, and then verified permissions can match it up to all the existing policies that are attached to that resource that is being requested access to.
I apologize. That might have been a non-developer type question.
No, this is
but
great.
I'm trying to think through this.
Right.
It's actually a great question because it talks about the boundaries, and it's a shared responsibility model about what is the application developer doing, what is verified permissions doing, and what is it that the identity provider is doing, and which is part of the reason we really wanted to provide an easy solution. So if you are an Amazon Cognito user, it's very easy. You don't even have to think. You don't even have to transform the attributes that you get out of your Cognito token. It's an additional field in the is authorized call. You can pass in the is authorized call, and then everything happens on your behalf.
Yeah, so I can imagine you just have to think through and design your policies, and then everyone will kind of fall into that based on the groups and everything.
Yeah. So we kind of, we're not totally prescriptive in how you go about it, clearly, but there's a general path that we advise people to take.
Okay.
So the first is to define what you might describe as your permissions model. And you can almost write that as a narrative that you would work on with the business owner of the product, might be the product owner or whatever. And that's just a narrative that describes who's allowed to do what in this application that you're building. So then from that narrative, you can shake out a schema where you've actually captured, okay, these are the entities that we're creating permissions on. These are the entities that we're creating permissions for. These are the different actions that we're creating permissions around. These are the attributes that we'll need to take into account. And all of that is formalized into a schema, and that schema can then be used to validate that the policies that you create are in line with the authorization model that you've set up. And then once you've done that, you're then, as an application developer, you can create that first set of policies in the policy store. But you can also create templates, which are shells of policies, which are then going to be used by the application in real time, so that when you share a photo with me, there's going to be a policy created on the fly that reflects the fact that I'm now allowed to see that photo.
Gotcha.
That's going to be created off the back of a template that was built by the developer as part of the creation of the application.
Okay, so after all these questions and answers, I can see how this is just typically everything we've just described, a developer had to incorporate this into their application.
Yes.
And that means a bunch of different developer teams, a bunch of different applications. This could have been done a different way in each application, depending on who wrote it, what app. But now we're creating this one easy way that would help probably corporations standardize on how application security and authorization is done. So, yeah. Thank you for the questions, because now it's a lot clearer to me. This is great.
And that's exactly where we want to say what the advantages of using verified permissions is consistency.
Yeah.
You get the same permissions model across all your different hundreds, sometimes thousands of applications. You have scalability. At AWS, we have a lot of experience running authorization at scale. We saw in CJ's keynote talking about IAM is running 1 billion requests a second. And so as applications grow and businesses grow, you want that scalability and security top of mind. Security administrators can now go in one place to say, oh, what does Jasmine have access to? They don't have to go to 50,000 different applications to try to figure out, does Jasmine have access to this? Compliance becomes a lot easier.
And I think I try to be careful with the word easy, but it also sounds that this is a pretty nice way to get started with zero trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's not a lot of effort to get this going, and then you can say, oh, well, we're kind of doing zero trust a little bit because this is checking each and every action. So I could see that's in for zero trust as well.
And it becomes easy to add more things. You want to say, hey, I'm going to add device posture requirement for larger parts of my organization. You can do it in a single place. And you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily easy, but it helps you move along in the journey.
Yeah. So we could say that Jasmine's laptop needs an update, so therefore any machine that needs an update is not going to be access to my pictures in our app. Yeah. So
absolutely.
That's really cool. So, we're getting close to time. Anything else you want to relay to our viewers? Last thoughts.
So I'd just call out, we're at a security conference, so we've talked a lot about the security angle on this.
Yeah.
There's also a big angle which we've seen very attractive to customers through the gated preview that we ran, which is just application developers can work quicker. They can build faster. Like, this is a ton of lines of code that they no longer need to write. And so while the CISO is obsessed about getting security in place, the CIO is also very obsessed about, what's the productivity of their development teams?
Yeah.
And this is a tool to increase that productivity.
And I know we always tend to demo like an Adopt a Pet website for internal things. So if the CISO is getting his salary based on pets being adopted, and so if the developers can concentrate on making that better for the customers and less on security, it's a win-win.
Exactly.
Yeah. My message is, don't roll your own authorization.
Yeah.
We don't roll our own authentication. 10 years ago, we did.
Yeah.
People were like, oh, usernames and passwords in a database. We don't roll our own authentication. We don't roll our own cryptographic things. So let's not roll our own authorization.
And what folks did 10 years ago is leading the problems today, because they're stuck in that.
Yes.
And it's grown and evolved over those 10 years, and it's hard to get away from them and to convince the security team to get away from that. So, that point taken. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome.
If you're talking about convincing people, what do you think? How could you convince people right now? People are just joining the stream. They're like, what are we even talking about? We're talking about Amazon verified permissions. But how do you convince them to get started?
It helps you do your job better.
Yeah.
It helps you focus on what you're good at. And so now you don't have, for all the things, for consistency, scalability, as well as security, you don't have to worry a thing that doesn't add value to your application and makes your life easier and faster and more agile.
And if it was me, if I was a developer who just got out of a sprint meeting and I was assigned, Jeff, go ahead and start working on authorization, I'd be like, verified permissions. I'm going to go check this out.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe there is a developer in you after all.
No. All right, so thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it. This was great. I learned a lot, obviously. You guys have taught me a lot. And we will be right back in a few moments with more AWS On Air live from Anaheim, California at Reinforce 2023.